Daniel Sports Central, we go over our 2022 college football predictions for the Oregon State Beavers, team that went 7-6 overall in the 2021 season. But all this team being 2022 and whether or not Oregon State will be even better in the 2022 season is what we go over here today. We'll be analyzing this team and predict their schedule game by game in this video. Starting out with your team trends, Oregon State 7-6 last season. They were 4-2 in their first 6 games, 3-4 in their last 7. So overall, this wasn't a bad season for Oregon State. Definitely a step in the right direction, especially after a very disappointing past few seasons. This team has been terrible and towards the bottom of the Pac-12 the past few years. But, once again, a step in the right direction for sure for the Beavers as we head into 2022. And, 7-6, this is a team that really had very low expectations as well going into 2021. This team wasn't expected to be very good. Considering the inexperience and just once again, this team is in a full-on rebuilding phase right now. So 2021, this team wasn't expected to be too good, but turns out they were, I would say, a top half team in the Pac-12. And 7-6, this team they were a good team last year. So heading into 2022, the expectations are definitely higher as they were versus 2021 for sure. But rightfully so. This team is returning some talent going into 2022. But looking back on 2021, this team, they did play a difficult schedule, and they fared out pretty well. They lost to Purdue in week 1, 21-30. It turns out Purdue was a really good football team last year. They got up to 9 wins, and it was a great season for the Boilermakers. So Oregon State did take a loss there, even though certainly put up a good fight. They beat USC on the road 45-27 there in late September. And considering USC last season, USC had some high expectations going into 2021. So for Oregon State, a team who had low expectations at the time, to go into USC and pull off a win like that, that was definitely a surprise, but it definitely allowed people to take Oregon State more seriously. They also beat Utah, the eventual Pac-12 champion, 42-34, beat Stanford 35-14. But did take a couple of tough losses to finish out the season. Lost to Oregon on the road, 29-38, and then lost to Utah State to finish out the season in the LA Bowl, 13-24. So, they put up fights against both Oregon and Utah State. Certainly would have been huge if they could have won at least one of those games, but in the end didn't happen, and this team was 7-6 last season. But looking forward to 2022, now your roster preview going into next season. This team does return the starting quarterback Chance Nolan, who last season put up 2,600 yards, 19 touchdowns, 10 picks, and a 64% completion rate. He also rushed for nearly 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, so not a bad season for Chance Nolan, even though there's certainly some improvement to be made by him if this team wants to take the next step and potentially be a Pac-12 contender. But they do lose their second quarterback, Sam Neuer. He was definitely in the quarterback situation going into last season, but turns out just wasn't the man for the job, and Chance Nolan had the better season. So heading into 2022, there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that Nolan is a very heavy favorite to be the starting quarterback. He just is the most talented guy in this situation right now. You do lose your top running back in B.J. Baylor. Last season, he was a key player for this offense, 1,400 yards and 13 touchdowns. So, he had a great season for the Beavers, and once again, tough loss there in the backfield going into next season. That is probably one of my main concerns about this team, is losing your top in the backfield there, but you do have Deshaun Fenwick coming back, and in general, you got some good depth there in the backfield. So that is a good sign, even though you do lose your top there in Baylor. But Fenwick put up nearly 500 yards and 4 touchdowns last year, so not bad stats out of him, even though certainly that's a difference in comparison to B.J. Baylor's 1,400 from last season. The receiving core, you lose your top there in Trevon Bradford, who put up just over 600 yards last year and 6 touchdowns. So you lose him, but you return your second receiver in Treshawn Harrison, and you lose your third receiver there in Champ Fleming. So you got Harrison coming back, your second wideout from last season, who put up just over 400 yards and 3 touchdowns. But once again, you do lose your third there in Flemings. But on the bright side, you also got your tight end coming back, and your fourth in receiving from last season coming back in Luke Musgrave. So you got your second and your fourth in the receiving court coming back for next season. You lose your top in the backfield, and you got your quarterback coming back. So overall, I'd say the potential is definitely there for this offense to potentially be better next season, even though obviously it'd be great if you could have, Champ Fleming's come back at least. Obviously, he's transferring out, which, it's tough to see a guy go when he's still got eligibility. And that could have been huge for this receiving core, especially to have, that would have meant they would have their second through fourth in the receiving core back, but unfortunately, that's not how it is. The offensive line, I'm a bit concerned about. You lose 3 on there, and defensively, this team returns almost everybody. They lose 1 on the offense, or 1 on the linebacking in the linebacking core, but otherwise, you lose a couple in the transfer portal. But overall, defensively, this team really shows some big potential going into 2022. And as I mentioned, offensively as well, this team looks pretty good. So brings the question, will this team be even better in 2022? Could Oregon State be a Pac-12 contender in the 2022 season? I think the potential's there once again. This team last year was pretty close to being an 8 or 9 win team. And they just took a couple of close losses there. And once again, if you look back to the Oregon and Utah State games in particular, both games were close. And I'd say winnable for the Beavers as well. But in the end, they just took a couple of close losses there, and those weren't the only 2 close losses for this team last season. So I think the potential is there for this team to be even better in 2022. It's just a matter of if this team can, in the backfield, excel there, even though they're losing their top there in B.J. Baylor. And obviously, the offensive line is a bit of a concern, but defensively, this team should definitely be better. But looking at your transfer portal and recruiting now going to next season, once again, Champ Flemings is in the transfer portal. You also lose receiver Zariah Beeson, who was, I believe, the 5th in the receiving core. He's off to Washington State. You lose offensive lineman Cooper Darling. You bring in Jameis Griffin, a running back from Georgia Tech. And you lose a couple defensively here. Defensive back JoJo Forst, who's off to Hawaii. Junior Walling, a linebacker who's in the transfer portal. You also lose Demir Collins, a running back to Idaho State. And quarterback Sam Bidlek, who is off to Boise State. So don't really bring in too much from the transfer portal. You lose a few of your players. And recruiting-wise, of course, you're 56th in the nation, 6th in the Pac-12. No 4 stars, but 16 3-stars coming in. So recruiting-wise, not terrible in comparison to the Pac-12, even though nationally, obviously 56th could be better. But that said, let's look at your schedule now going into next season. You got Boise State in week 1, so a challenging matchup there. Boise State is usually a pretty good football team, so you don't want to sleep on that one. And then a road trip to Fresno State in week 2. You got Montana State in week 3, USC at home on the 24th. And then in October, you got Utah and Stanford both on the road, and then Washington State and Colorado both at home. In November, you got Washington on the road, California at home, Arizona State on the road, and then Oregon at home to finish out your season. So, last season you had a pretty challenging schedule there. Of course, having to play Utah, and of course, you can't forget about Oregon. That's always a challenging matchup to finish out the season. And of course, Purdue is one of your non-conference games. This season, you got Boise State there, but at least you got them at home. So that is to your benefit. I feel like this is a more manageable schedule than it was, at least in comparison to last season. So that also raises the potential for this team heading into 2022 here. But looking at September, Boise State, I think you knock off the Broncos there. Potentially a closer game, but I think that you do pull that one out in the end. And you also beat Fresno State on the road, even though a bit closer than some may think. So you're 2-0. I do think this team starts out 2-0, and they easily beat Montana State to get up to 3-0. So, potentially slip up against Boise State or Fresno State. That could happen once again. I'm not saying it's a guarantee that the Beavers do win both of those first or 2 games. But I do think, in my opinion, this team does start the season 3-0. Then you got USC at home. You beat them last season, but I feel like USC is a much better team this year. They're built really. This is a USC team that has transformed through the transfer portal in the past year. With Caleb Williams, with Travis Dye, with defensively some of their key players, and of course Lincoln Riley, just an excellent head coach. USC is going to be a contender next season. So I have you losing to them, even though you got them at home. So you're 3-1 heading into October, which October you got a couple of tough games here. You got Utah on the road. I do think you lose to them. You also beat Utah last season, so you're able to knock them off too, but I do think you lose to them this year round. And then Stanford on the road. It's a winnable game, but I think you lose that one, especially after 2 straight tough losses there to USC and Utah. So That puts you at 3-3 heading to that Washington State matchup. I think you get back on track. You beat Washington State there, and you also beat Colorado there, potentially by 2 or 3 touchdowns. You got some good momentum heading into November with a 5-3 record. You only got to win 1 of your last 4 to get to a bowl game. I definitely think you do so. You do lose to Washington on the road, even though that is a winnable game there. That's on a Friday night there against Washington. So I do think you start slowing that matchup, and the Huskies in the end get the win off of you. And I feel like Washington and Oregon State are on a very even level going into next season skill-wise. And I wouldn't be surprised to see both teams go 7-5 next season. Then you got Cal and Arizona State. I think both those games are wins. Arizona State on the road. I think the Sun Devils next season they're gonna struggle, I think, with what's going on there. And I'm concerned about the Sun Devils, and I feel like Oregon State goes in there, gets a win. And then Oregon to finish out the season, you could get an 8-4 record if you beat Oregon there to finish out the regular season, but I don't think you do. I think the Ducks do beat you there in a close one, even though it is certainly a winnable game there. You could beat Oregon, but in the end, I think the Ducks pull off a win over the Beavers. So you're 7-5 next season. You get to a decent bowl game, potentially the LA Bowl again. We'll see what happens there, but overall 7-5, not a bad record for this team. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on Oregon State, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.